US President Donald Trump increased tariffs on China by an additional 50%, bringing the total of tariffs imposed in his second term on the world's second largest economy to 104%.
If you look at that, China, first row, China, 67%.
But how exactly were these tariffs calculated? Here is an explanation for it. When Trump presented a giant cardboard chart detailing the tariffs in the White House Rose Garden, it was initially assumed that the charges were based on a combination of existing tariffs and other trade barriers, as it was mentioned on the fine print. But later, the White House published what might look like a complicated mathematical formula. According to this formula, delta represents change in math. Tau used to represent tariff in this instance, with I being import rate. XI defined as total exports to country from US. MI defined as total imports from country to US. Epsilon used to represent price elasticity of import demand. The USTR set this at 4. Phi used to represent the elasticity of import prices with respect to tariffs. The USTR set this at 0.25. This means that tariff charged to US is equals to exports minus imports divided by 4 multiplied by 0.25 multiplied by imports, and for percentage you multiply it by 100 again. Since 4 multiplied by 0.25 is equals to 1, it boils down to simple maths. Exports minus imports, which is your trade deficit, divided by total US imports. For example, the US buys more goods from China than it sells to them. There is a goods deficit of $295.4 billion. The total amount of goods it buys from China is $438.9 billion. Dividing 295.4 by 435.9 gets you to 67%. And you divide that by 2 and round up. Therefore, the tariff imposed on China was earlier 34%. Similarly, when it is applied to India, exports from US to India stands at $41.8 billion and imports stand at $87.4 billion. According to the White House's formula, India's reciprocal tariffs are at 52%. But since Trump gave a 50% discount, you divide it by 2 and it comes at 26%. But is this math correct?
The important thing to note here is that this trade deficit only represents goods, merchandise goods, and not services, right? So that's the first, part of the equation. The bottom part of the equation also has this term M again, which is essentially the imports from this country ABC to the US. And then there are two elasticities that it is weighted by. The first one is the elasticity of import demand to import prices, which they assume to be 4. And the second is the elasticity of import prices to tariffs. Now, what does this mean? Import demand to import prices, it means that when import prices go up by 1%, to what extent does import demand reduce, right? And we're basically saying that when import prices go up by 1%, import demand would reduce by 4%, is what this 4 number indicates. And the second point is the 0.25, right? It says that if you increase tariffs by 1%, import prices will only go up by 0.25%. If you had actually done the correct calculation, then different assumptions on these elasticities would give us very different numbers. And estimates from, say, the American Economic Institute, they've actually varied the assumptions that, if the import prices, there's a full pass-through, that if tariff increases by 1%, the import prices will also go up by almost 1%, because importers will essentially pass through the entire increase in tariff to the consumers. Then the actual amount of tariff goes down to 10% for most countries. Essentially, the big message to understand: assumptions, they mean everything in this equation. And clearly, the assumption of 4 into 0.25, which leads to 1, leaves us with these very massive tariffs.